Thank you very much, Peter. And I am delighted to speak to you today. I wish I were there with you, but as Peter said, I am in Toronto. But I'm happy to have this opportunity to talk to you, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. So Peter has asked me to talk about municipal amalgamation, um, but particularly to look at four areas. The first is to look at municipal amalgamations in Canada. Often when people undertake different policies, they think they're the first one to do it. But I'm here to say this has been going on for decades and decades in Canada, as well as other countries around the world. In fact, I'm going to Indonesia in a couple of weeks to talk about metropolitan governance in municipalities there. I want to also talk about municipal finance a bit, because as Peter said, that's kind of the area that I work in, to see what financial pressures municipalities in Canada and indeed elsewhere are under, and how they're changing. The third area is to talk about amalgamation and what we see as the advantages and disadvantages, because I like to give a balanced view of amalgamation, the pros and cons. And lastly, talk a little bit about what the literature says. Peter asked me to do that, but I have to give you a spoiler alert. The literature is pretty mixed and not super helpful, but I'm happy to talk a little bit about that. So if we're looking at municipal amalgamations in Canada, I've categorized them in four ways: the most recent, the most famous, the most extensive, and the most dramatic. Those are just my words, and a way to categorize some of these amalgamations. But the most recent series of amalgamations just happened in New Brunswick this year, where 104 local governments and 236 local service districts were merged into 77 local governments and 12 rural districts. Plus, they have 12 regional service commissions that are responsible for some services over a regional basis. I can't tell you how it's working. It's kind of playing out as we're sitting here. And there's much more to do, because the government is trying to change the municipal finance system in light of this restructuring that has gone on. But it's a major restructuring. They've talked about it for years. There have been many reports, as is often the case, years and years of reports, and then finally something happens. And that happened this year in New Brunswick, 2024. I suppose the most famous, or perhaps the biggest amalgamation, was in Toronto in 1998. Before amalgamation, there was a metropolitan government, Metro Toronto, and 6 lower tier municipalities. Many studies were done of what should be done, perhaps creating a larger regional tier than Metro Toronto. But in fact, what the province of Ontario did was amalgamated the metropolitan tier and the 6 lower tiers and created one city of Toronto. And we can talk about how well that has worked or not worked, but it's a very large amalgamation. I think the most extensive amalgamations happened in the 1990s in Ontario. I mentioned Toronto, but we also saw Hamilton, Ottawa, and Sudbury take these 2-tier, regional and lower tier municipalities, and amalgamate them into single-tier cities. But in fact, what happened in Ontario prior to 1998, there were about 800 plus municipalities, and now there are 444. So major restructuring, lots of amalgamations that happened. And I have to say, some were imposed by the provincial government, like the ones mentioned here, Hamilton, Ottawa, Sudbury, Toronto. Some were voluntary. Now, people say, really voluntary, or were municipalities just worried the province was going to amalgamate them anyway, and they might as well make a decision about how they want to do it? And so they were done voluntarily, perhaps before the province came in and did it. I guess the most dramatic happened in Montreal, Quebec City, and Longueuil, because they did have amalgamations. And then a new provincial government came in and said, they called them fusion in French, and they said you could have defusion or demergers. And so in the case of Montreal, Quebec City, and Longueuil, some municipalities that were part of this new city, larger city, actually went back to being their own municipalities. Interesting case study. We can see how that worked as well. So we have tried lots of different governance models in Canada. And again, we see this when we go around the world too. I've talked about the one-tier consolidated, where you have amalgamations and you have one large city that does everything, provides all the services, raises all the money. We also have some single-tier cities with regional coordinating bodies. So if we look at Edmonton, Calgary, and Winnipeg as examples, they are single cities. It's not two-tier government, but they do have a regional coordinating body. Like in Edmonton, for example, there's the Edmonton Metropolitan Regional Board that consists of 13 municipalities. It's provincially mandated, and they deal with issues around growth management. There's a Winnipeg metropolitan region, there's something in Calgary. So again, they're single tier cities, but they see the need to coordinate with other municipalities around them. And so they formed these regional coordinating bodies. We have two-tier structures. So in Ontario, for example, we've got regions around Toronto, Durham, York, Peel, and Halton, where there's a regional government. And a number of lower tier governments. And I don't know if you read Ontario news, but at one point, the province said they wanted to dissolve Peel region. Peel has 3 lower tier municipalities, and the province said, let's get rid of the region. We don't need it. Let's just have 3 lower tier municipalities. They changed their mind on that. So they haven't dissolved Peel region. But that was certainly something being thought of. The regional district model. You're sitting there in the capital region district, Metro Vancouver, and all the other districts in BC. These are more voluntary. The boards of the districts are indirectly chosen from elected officials in the lower tiers. It's often considered a model for two-tier structure that works very well. But then we also have single purpose regional authorities. So you've got, for example, TransLink in BC, and you've got Metrolinx in the Toronto region. You've got global regional authorities to do economic development, to attract international development. Toronto has Toronto Global, Edmonton has Edmonton Global. Again, other places have the same thing. And then, of course, not listed here is the whole voluntary cooperation. So, across Canada, we see municipalities cooperating voluntarily, whether it's for fire and ambulance, some of these emergency services, we see a lot of cooperation that works very well because, frankly, if there's a fire, everybody goes. We figure out who's going to pay for it later. There's, voluntary cooperation on roads and water and many different areas. And that can be under any structure. It can be under a 1-tier, 2-tier, any structure. You'll see a lot of voluntary cooperation. So again, the point here is lots of models, lots of history, lots of change. We'll see lots more change, lots of studies, but a lot of things have happened in Canada over the last few decades. I want to switch now to the municipal fiscal pressures. And I want to make the point that local governments do a lot. They have limited revenue sources. And the problem of fiscal sustainability, the ability to meet those expenditures with the revenues they have, is worsening. It's getting worse. So municipalities do a lot. It's probably hard for you to see this on the screen, but I'm looking at municipal expenditures by province. All the provinces are along the bottom, and all of the different services are along the right-hand side. You don't need to look at this really closely. My point is local governments do a lot of things. The blue at the bottom, British Columbia is 4th from the right. a lot of, general public services, just general administration. You've got police, you've got fire, you've got transport, which includes roads and transit. You've got waste management, wastewater management, housing and community development, water supply, street lighting, health, recreation, culture, parks, libraries, social protection, and there's a little amount at the top for other. It varies around the country. Ontario, for example, municipalities share the cost of social services, and other provinces like BC, that's mostly paid for by the provincial government. But these are a lot of different services that local governments are involved in. And as you know, they're very visible services. I used to say to my graduate students when I was teaching municipal finance to the planning students, when you came to school this morning, how many municipal services have you used? And they don't really get it. And I say, well, did you have a shower? Did you put out the garbage? Did you turn on the lights? Did you walk to the transit system? Did you walk on the sidewalks, the roads? Did you walk through a park? And, they begin to see that what municipalities do is very visible and very much a part of their lives. Where we see less diversity is in the revenues. And again, this is municipal revenues by province and territory. Property taxes are the blue at the bottom. And so except for the territories, that's the major source of revenue to local governments in Canada. Goods and services taxes are largely development charges. So these data from these two charts are from Statistics Canada. And I have to say, I don't love the breakdowns they use. But development charges do appear in that orange category of goods and services taxes. User fees, very important source of revenue for municipalities in BC, of course, as well. Other revenues and the other local revenues, and then intergovernmental transfers. So that would be grants from the federal and provincial governments. And they vary across the country. You can see that. But basically, those are the revenues that municipalities have. Well, what are they facing coming down the road? And I often give, whole half-hour talks on this slide alone. And so I'm going to not do that because I want to leave room for discussion. And these are not all of the challenges that local governments are facing. Like the opioid crisis should be on there as well. But the infrastructure deficit, we hear about a lot. And we see it, we've seen water main breaks in Montreal and in Calgary. We've seen roads and transit deteriorating, and people put numbers to this. It's billions of dollars that are needed to put our infrastructure in a state of good repair, because almost half of it, when we look across Canada, is not in a state of good repair. So billions of dollars is not all going to be from local governments, but a lot of it is going to be from local governments, because local governments own 60% of all public infrastructure in Canada. So they're a big player in the infrastructure world. The shortage of affordable housing, we're seeing this every day. Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, CMHC, is saying we need to build another 3.5 million houses before something like 2030. Huge costs there. Immigration and refugee settlement. Again, these are decisions that are made by the federal government, but have implications for local governments, particularly in the short run, in terms of providing housing and services, for example. Climate change, something we also are seeing every day. And there are two aspects to climate change that affect local governments. One is extreme weather events. So whether it's forest fires or floods or hurricanes, local governments are part of the group that has to pay for a cleanup from these events. But the other aspect of climate change is, we have a commitment in Canada to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And a lot of those greenhouse gas emissions happen in cities. And so local governments have to do things like electrify transit or retrofit buildings. There are a lot of things that local governments need to do to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and reach those targets. And then there's the whole phenomenon of working from home, and people are shopping online. And What does that mean for the commercial property tax base? Are we going to be losing value in that base? And what does that mean for property taxes? Does it mean more residential property taxes? Does it mean we're going to have to cut services? So, these are a number of challenges that are coming at municipalities. But nothing much has changed on the revenue side. They still have property taxes, user fees, and transfers from federal and provincial governments. So I say here, the world is changing, but is municipal finance? The foundation of municipal finance in Canada goes back to the Baldwin Act in Ontario. That was 1849, and a lot of local government and municipal acts today are based on that. Well, then, as I said, municipalities didn't do very much, and so they had property taxes, user fees, and transfers. It worked out fine. But the world has changed, and municipal revenues have not, and that's why we're seeing municipalities, local government associations going to the federal and provincial governments and saying, this isn't working. We need some other sources of revenue. So that's the context that we're living in that we have to think about. So the third thing I was going to talk about was the advantages and disadvantages of amalgamation. And there are both advantages and disadvantages. Some of the potential advantages are economies of scale, and I'm sure you've heard a lot about that already. I know that Bob Bish spoke to you earlier, and I'm sure he talked a lot about economies of scale. We've done some work on that as well. So, I mean, if you're a really small government, sometimes you can lower your costs by combining services with another government, and the cost of those services per capita will fall. I'll come back to that in a minute. There's also the ability to share costs equitably. So, one municipality may be providing a service that's being used by people in a neighboring municipality, but they're not paying for it. You're paying property taxes where you live, not where you necessarily work or visit. And so this is a way of sharing costs equitably. All the people enjoying the services are the people paying for them. It also allows for some redistribution. So, for example, if you've got a fairly rich municipality with a large tax base, and you've got a fairly poor municipality next door, by providing services together, you can redistribute. So the people in the less rich municipality can have an advantage of combining with a richer municipality. Reducing spillovers, again, that's where the services spill over the municipal boundaries, but people don't pay for them. By combining municipalities, combining the geographic area over which you're providing services, you can reduce those spillovers. You can coordinate service delivery better. You can coordinate planning better. These are all things you can do when you have larger municipalities. The downside that people talk about mostly is really about access and accountability. Do you lose local access when you become a bigger municipality? So I can tell you in Toronto, for example, we have 3 million people, one city hall. That's harder for people to access, although they've kept some of the local city halls. But, council meetings are in the one city hall. Does that mean less access for people? One could argue in this new age of the internet, it's not as hard, but it's still a question. And local responsiveness and accountability, is that lessened when you're bigger? So those are the discussions that we see happening around amalgamation, around the advantages and disadvantages. And the last thing I want to do is just talk a little bit about the literature. But again, as I said at the beginning, the literature is pretty mixed. Everything is so context specific. You have to look at where you are and what the problem is that you're trying to solve and how you're going to do that. So yes, larger governments have a larger tax base and they're more able to make capital investments. So that's a reason for amalgamation. There's some literature. Better service coordination, the redistribution. We found in the Toronto amalgamation, there was a lot of downsides to the Toronto amalgamation. But one of the upsides was there were some municipalities that were really not providing an adequate level of service, and they had high tax rates. And when they amalgamated with the other municipalities, they were able to see lower tax rates and better services. Economies of scale, well, that's a big question mark. There is a literature on that, but it suggests that for services like fire and policing, you achieve economies of scale, but mostly at 20 to 40,000 people. So for small places to amalgamate, you will see some economies of scale, but you can actually get to be too large and see what we call diseconomies of scale. You become so large that your costs go up. And that's what we saw in Toronto, because we merged, for example, 6 fire departments. And yes, we didn't need 5 fire chiefs anymore. We only needed 1. But the salaries of the firefighters all migrated up to what the most expensive municipality was paying. And the service levels went up to what the most expensive municipality was paying. So actually we found not only were there not economies of scale, costs went up. And that's why I say at the end, does it really save money? That amalgamation didn't. But again, if you're bringing together smaller municipalities, there is the ability to save money. So, when you look at the literature, it's mixed. It really depends on what kind of amalgamation you're looking at. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen, and I look forward